"You're an embarrassment, Zara." The words landed in the middle of the most expensive restaurant in the city, and for a moment everything stopped, the soft jazz, the murmur of other conversations, even the careful breathing of the three couples seated at table 12 who had just witnessed something that couldn't be taken back. Nathan Patterson let the silence stretch the way a man does when he's used to filling rooms with his own voice and expects the room to be grateful for it. He sat at the head of the table in his perfectly pressed charcoal suit, his platinum blonde hair catching the light from the crystal chandelier above, like he'd arranged it that way on purpose. His jaw set with the particular tightness of someone who had decided long before this evening began exactly how it would end. He looked at his wife the way you look at something you've already decided to throw away, not with anger, but with something colder than that, something that had been building quietly for months, inside a man who had convinced himself that wanting more was the same as deserving more. Zara sat across from him in the black dress he had specifically requested she wear 3 days ago, with the modest pearl earrings and the low heels, everything chosen exactly as he had instructed and still somehow wrong. She felt the heat rise to her face, but it wasn't shame. She recognized that immediately. The way you recognize the difference between fire and the memory of fire. It was fury, white and clean and dangerous. The kind that comes not from being surprised, but from finally being forced to see something you had been looking away from for a very long time. Harold Ashton sat to Nathan's left, the kind of man whose presence in a room changes the quality of the air. Silver-haired, broad-shouldered, with the measured stillness of someone who had built something real and didn't need to announce it. His wife Patricia was beside him, her expression shifting into something careful and kind as her eyes moved to Zara. The other two couples at the table had gone very quiet, the way people do when they're witnessing something that makes them grateful they're not the ones at the center of it, though not quite grateful enough to intervene. Jerome. I think Zara started using the name she had called him in private for years, because Nathan was what his business card said, and Jerome was who he actually was, or who she had believed he was. Don't think he said, cutting her off with a laugh that was shaped like amusement, but made entirely of contempt. That's the problem, isn't it? You never think. He turned to the men across from him with the easy confidence of someone delivering a punchline he'd already rehearsed. Gentlemen, this is what happens when you marry beneath your station. My wife used to work at a community center. Can you imagine Harold Ashton's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, something tightening around his eyes? There's nothing wrong with public service, he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a man who meant it. Nathan waved the comment away like smoke. She handed out assistance forms and helped people fill out paperwork. Meanwhile, I was building an investment firm from the ground up. He reached for his wine glass, the most expensive bottle on the menu, which he had ordered without consulting anyone, and took a long, satisfied sip. The point is, success requires sacrifice. Sometimes that means leaving dead weight behind. The table went so still that Zara could hear the jazz pianist 2 rooms away playing something slow and melancholy, completely indifferent to what was unfolding at table 12. She looked at her husband's face, searched it the way she had been searching it for months, without admitting to herself that she was searching, looking for some trace of the man who used to call her his brilliant queen, who used to brag about her work to anyone who would listen, who once drove 4 hours to attend a conference where she was presenting a paper on urban development funding structures because he said he wanted to see her in her element. That man was not sitting across from her tonight. Maybe she was beginning to understand he had never fully existed at all. Maybe she had built him out of the parts of Jerome that were easiest to love and called that the whole person. She reached for her water glass, and her hands were steady, which surprised her. Nathan stood abruptly, the legs of his chair scraping against the marble floor with a sound that cut through every conversation within earshot. He tossed his linen napkin onto his barely touched plate with the flourish of a man who had been waiting all evening for this exact gesture. "Gentlemen, I apologize for this evening," he said, and his voice had shifted into the professional register, smooth, regretful, the voice he used in boardrooms when delivering bad news he didn't actually feel bad about. My wife has a way of diminishing what should have been a celebration. I have an early morning tomorrow, so I'll have to say goodnight. Nathan, please sit down, Patricia, Ashton said softly, and there was something in her voice, not quite a plea, more like the patient firmness of a woman who had watched too many men perform for their peers at the expense of people sitting beside them. This isn't necessary. It absolutely is, he said, and now the smoothness cracked just slightly enough to show the real thing underneath. He checked his watch with a theatrical gesture that managed to insult every person sitting at the table simultaneously. The bill tonight is $5,000. His eyes found Zara's and stayed there. I trust you can handle it. Consider it your contribution to my future. The words hit her like cold water poured slowly, deliberately over the back of her neck. $5,000. He knew exactly what was in her personal checking account because he had been monitoring it for months, framing it as helping her budget, which was the kind of thoughtfulness that looks like care until you understand what it actually is. You're leaving, she said, and it wasn't a question. I'm choosing my future over my past. He leaned down close enough that only she could hear him, his platinum hair near her face, his cologne suddenly suffocating. Don't embarrass me further by making a scene. He straightened, shook hands with the stunned businessman, Harold. Ashton hesitated before extending his hand, and Nathan either didn't notice or chose not to, and walked away from the table with the confident stride of a man who believes the story ends when he stops watching it. At the table beside them, a woman with silver hair, pulled back in a neat bun, sat very still. Her phone clutched in hands that trembled slightly, not from age but from something that looked like recognition. The particular tremor of a person who has witnessed a kind of cruelty they've seen before and could not this time look away from. She pressed record. Patricia Ashton reached across the table immediately. Honey, we can take care of the bill. You don't have to. Thank you, Zara said, and her voice came out steady, which still surprised her. That won't be necessary. She reached into her purse and took out her wallet, and then she held it in her hands for a moment and felt something shift inside her chest. Not a breaking, but a closing. A door swinging shut on a room she had been standing in for too long. She put the wallet back. Actually, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the table, and she was aware to several tables nearby, Nathan was right about one thing. This bill is his responsibility. He ordered the wine. He chose the tasting menu for everyone. He invited all of us here. She looked directly at Harold Ashton, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name but would later recognize as respect. Mr. Ashton, when Nathan contacts you about your business arrangement, you might want to ask yourself what kind of man abandons his wife with a $5,000 dinner bill. She stood, smoothed her dress, picked up her clutch, and smiled. Not the careful, managed smile she had worn like armor at every one of Nathan's business functions for 8 years, but something new, something that came from a different place entirely. Ladies, gentlemen, enjoy your evening. She walked out of Lou Bernardine with her head high and her spine straight, and the September air outside hit her face like the first breath after a long time underwater. The house felt larger than it ever had when Zara pushed open the front door at midnight, and not in a way that felt like freedom, not yet. It felt like a held breath, like a room waiting to exhale every familiar surface, somehow strange under the silence. She kicked her heels off in the entryway and left them exactly where they fell, which was something Nathan had never once allowed without comment, and the small rebellion gave her a flicker of something she didn't have a name for yet. She noticed the wrongness before she reached the bedroom, the way a drawer in the hallway chest was left slightly open, the faint evidence of someone moving through a space quickly with purpose. The bedroom confirmed it. Nathan's closet door stood a few inches ajar, and when she opened it fully, she found exactly what the ajar door had promised. Half his suits were gone. The row of expensive shoes thinned to gaps. The glass-topped case where he kept his watch collection, 8 watches, some worth more than most people's cars, was entirely empty, not even a smudge in the velvet. He hadn't left impulsively. He had packed while she was sitting across from him in the restaurant wearing the dress he had chosen, performing the role he had written for her. On his pillow sat a manila envelope with her name written across the front, in Nathan's precise, controlled handwriting, the handwriting of a man who believed that neatness was a form of superiority. Inside was a letter on his business letterhead addressed to her the way he would address a client he was dropping. Zara. It began and ended 3 paragraphs later after informing her she had 30 days to vacate with Sincerely Nathan. Sincerely. Behind the letter were bank statements, account after account, all bearing her name alone. Accounts she had held before they married, accounts she had nearly forgotten, showing months of systematic withdrawals, cash advances, transfers she hadn't authorized to numbers she didn't recognize. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Stop trying to log in. I changed the passwords. You'll get what you deserve in the divorce." He had been watching her, monitoring her, planning this for months, while she smiled at his dinners and pretended not to notice how his eyes followed his 25-year-old assistant Candace Rivera across every room they shared. Zara walked to his office. The spare key was where it always was, taped under the middle drawer, because Nathan was predictable in ways that mattered. At the back of his filing cabinet, behind a folder marked tax documents, she found one labeled CR Personal. She opened it, and the last piece of the picture fell into place. She sat in his leather chair for a long moment, surrounded by evidence of a betrayal so thoroughly planned it was almost impressive, and then she picked up her phone and called Rel Martinez. It was 2 a.m. She called anyway. Rel Martinez's downtown office at 7 a.m. looked exactly like what it was. The workspace of a woman who had never once allowed anyone to make her feel that she didn't belong somewhere, and sitting across the wide conference table from her best friend of 15 years, Zara felt the first small loosening of the knot that had been tightening in her chest since midnight. "Show me everything," Rele said, and her voice carried the particular quality it had always had in law school. Sharp focused the voice of someone who had already decided that the problem in front of her was solvable and was simply waiting for the facts to confirm it. Zara spread the documents across the table, the bank statements, the credit card bills, the folder of receipts and transfers from the CR Personal file, the printed email exchange between Nathan and Roberto Rivera, and the photos she had taken of his office on her phone before she left. She laid them out methodically in chronological order because she had spent the hours between 2 and 5 in the morning organizing them, needing to do something with her hands while her mind refused to stop working. Rel studied each page with the focus of a surgeon reading imaging results quickly, precisely, her dark eyes moving without hurry, but missing nothing. She didn't gasp, didn't shake her head dramatically, didn't offer premature comfort. She read. When she set the last page down, she looked up. "This is very bad," she said. "For him, not for you." Relief moved through Zara's chest like warm water. She had been afraid that somehow, in the strange, distorted logic that abusive situations create over time, she had been misreading the severity of it, that perhaps Nathan's lawyers would find a way to make it look like administrative confusion. Shared finances mismanaged, nothing criminal, nothing intentional. He accessed accounts that only bore your name. Rele continued her pen, already moving across a legal pad. "That's not a marital dispute. That's theft. And if those funds were diverted to finance an extramarital relationship," she let the sentence complete itself in the air between them. "Can I get it back?" Zara asked. "The money." Rele looked at her over the top of her reading glasses with the expression of someone about to say something better than yes. "Tell me about your assets." "Everything. Don't protect his feelings. He's not in the room." For the next 40 minutes, Zara told the full story of her financial life. The $600,000 her grandmother had left her in a separate account that Nathan didn't know existed, the retirement fund from her previous employer, that she'd never touched, the small investment portfolio she'd built in the years before the marriage, back when she was still fully herself. She had never mentioned these to Nathan, not out of deception, but because he had never asked. He had assumed, as he assumed most things about her, rather than bothering to find out. Relly sat back in her chair and allowed herself a very small, very satisfied smile. He thinks he left you with nothing but debt and humiliation. He doesn't know you were holding cards the whole time. What do we do first? We freeze every joint account immediately today before he can touch another dollar. Then we let him make his next move, and he will make one, because men like Nathan always do something stupid when they realize the plan isn't going the way they drew it up. Relly set down her pen and looked at Zara directly the way she had been looking at her since 1997, when they were both graduate students pulling all-nighters in the same library. But before any of that, I need to ask you something. Go ahead. When did you stop being Zara Collins and start being Nathan Patterson's wife? The question hit her somewhere she hadn't been expecting, somewhere she had apparently been carefully not touching for years. I don't know, she said quietly. I do, Relly said. You graduated summa from Northwestern, top 5% of your class. You speak 3 languages. You managed a $2 million community development budget and published research in national journals that people still cite today. And somewhere in the last 8 years, you let a man convince you that the most interesting thing about you was who you'd married. She picked up her pen again. We're going to fix that. By 9 in the morning, Relly had a plan sketched across 4 pages of her legal pad divorce proceedings. Asset recovery documentation for the criminal complaint, and something Zara hadn't expected, a professional relaunch strategy. Urban Development Consulting, Relly said, drawing a box around the words like she was framing something important. Community planning, nonprofit management, grant coordination, all the things you were exceptional at before you became someone's accessory. Your network is still intact. You never burned those bridges, you just stopped crossing them. The idea moved through Zara with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. Something that felt dangerously close to excitement, which seemed almost inappropriate given the circumstances, but Relly had always said that forward motion was the best response to being knocked down, not because the pain wasn't real, but because the alternative was staying on the ground. They spent an hour going through names former professors from Northwestern who had moved into policy advising colleagues from the community center who had since built their own organizations. Researchers and planners she'd met at conferences back when she was still attending them, before Nathan had quietly, persistently suggested that those circles were beneath where their life was now that she was outgrowing those associations, that successful people moved upward, not backward. She had believed him. That was the thing she was still learning to sit with. Not that he had lied, but that she had chosen slowly and over time to believe the version of herself that his lies required. Outside Relly's office building, as they walked to the elevators, Zara became aware of a child sitting in the hallway on a plastic chair. A girl, perhaps 12 years old, with neat braids and a backpack in her lap, waiting with the patient stillness of a child, accustomed to accompanying her mother to places where adults handled complicated things. The girl's mother, a woman in a cleaning company uniform, was speaking quietly to the receptionist near the front desk. The girl looked up as Zara passed, and there was something observant and unhurried in her expression, the way children sometimes watch adults when they sense that something significant has just occurred, even if they don't have the vocabulary for what it is. As Zara pushed through the glass door into the morning air, she heard the girl say to her mother, in a voice that carried just far enough, "Maman." Why did she look like she was about to fall when she went in, but she looks like she's about to fly now? Zara didn't hear the question, but the mother turned to look through the glass at the woman walking down the steps toward the street and something in the mother's face went soft, and knowing the way people look when they recognize a feeling they've carried themselves. Zara stood on the sidewalk in the September morning, pulled out her phone, and dialed the number of a commercial real estate agent she'd worked with years ago, before the marriage had swallowed her professional ambitions whole. "I need to sublet a small office space," she said when he answered, her voice clear and direct in a way that surprised even her. "Something with good light. I'm starting a consulting practice." She hung up and stood still for a moment, watching the city move around her people with places to be, work to do, purposes that were entirely their own, and she felt for the first time in what she now understood had been a very long time, like she was one of them again. She had work to do. The text came that afternoon. "Have you taken care of the restaurant bill yet?" She deleted it without responding and kept reading the zoning amendment documents she had pulled up on her laptop research. For a Portland development project, she was already mentally designing the proposal for working from instincts she had apparently kept alive through sheer stubbornness, even while everything else was being quietly dismantled. 2 days later, Nathan appeared at the house. She saw him through the peephole platinum blonde hair perfect, despite the roses he was carrying, which he held with the studied casualness of a man who has practiced appearing spontaneous, and she recognized the particular quality of his expression through the fisheye lens, the rehearsed contrition, the arrangement of features she had once confused for sincerity. She continued reading her zoning documents. He stood on the porch for 11 minutes. She counted. Then he left. When he called that evening, she answered because she had decided on the drive home from Rel's office that there would be one conversation clean final, not for his benefit, but for hers, because she had spent too many years arranging herself around his comfort, and she wanted just once to say the things she had been not saying for years. "Zara, listen." "I'm listening," she said. "That's always been more your problem than mine." He launched into it, the pressure he'd been under. The mistakes made under stress, the possibility of counseling. The word borrowed used to describe what she had found documented in his own handwriting as theft. The word landed wrong, and she felt something shift in her chest. Not the old impulse to smooth things over, to make the tension smaller, to make herself smaller along with it, but the opposite. "Borrowed," she said, and the word came out with enough edge that he stopped mid-sentence. She didn't shout. She had never been a person who needed volume to make a point, and she wasn't going to start now. She spoke steadily with the particular calm of someone who has spent a sleepless night organizing their thoughts and no longer needs to be afraid of the person they're speaking to. She told him what she knew. The accounts, the transfers, the folder with Candace Rivera's name on it, the emails to Roberto Rivera asking permission to court his daughter after the divorce was finalized. She told him she knew the timeline that the first withdrawal from her personal accounts happened the same week Candace started working at his firm, which meant that every romantic gesture he had made toward that woman had been funded with money that belonged to Zara. He went very quiet. "I have an MBA from Northwestern," she said, not loudly, not as a performance, but as a simple statement of a fact she had been allowing him to treat as irrelevant for years. "I managed multi-million-dollar budgets. I speak 3 languages, and I've published research that other people have built careers on. The only thing I still don't understand is how I spent 8 years letting you convince me I was less than I am. Zara, be reasonable. I am being extremely reasonable. Here is what happens now. You communicate with me only through our attorneys. You do not come to this house. You do not call this number." She paused for one beat. "And you discover that the woman you thought was too weak to survive without you is strong enough to make sure everyone in this city knows exactly who you are." She ended the call and turned the phone face down on the table. Through the window, the September night was clear and cold and full of stars, and she sat with it for a long moment. The quiet, the space, the strange lightness of a life that was suddenly, terrifyingly, entirely her own. She had work to do. Relay called at 8:15 on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after Lou Bernardine and Zara knew from the quality of the silence in the half-second before her friend spoke that something significant had happened. "Have you looked at social media today? I've been working since 6. Why?" "Someone filmed Nathan's performance at the restaurant," Rel said, and her voice had the particular quality of someone trying very hard not to sound as excited as they are. "The whole thing. It's everywhere. The woman with the silver hair." Zara had thought about her once or twice in the weeks since that night, the way her hands had trembled, the way she had seemed to recognize something in what she was watching, the specific quality of her attention. She had made a decision, that woman in a restaurant, where everyone else had looked away or looked down at their plates or pretended to be very interested in their wine. Rello sent the link and Zara watched it at her desk with the door closed, and the experience was genuinely strange watching yourself from outside, seeing the woman in the black dress from someone else's angle. Nathan's voice came through the phone speaker with a clarity that the original moment had somehow muffled with shock, every word, every pause. The precise moment he tossed his napkin down the angle of his jaw when he announced the $5,000 bill. The way he leaned down to whisper something to Zara before straightening and shaking hands with men who no longer knew what to do with their faces. But the camera had caught something else. Something Zara hadn't known was visible from the outside. It had caught her stillness, the steadiness of her hands, the moment she put the wallet back, the way she stood up slowly like someone who had made a decision that had nothing to do with performance, and spoke clearly and directly to Harold Ashton, before walking out of the frame with a posture that said without a single unnecessary word that she knew exactly who she was. The hashtag $5,000 disgrace had been trending since Sunday night. A second one, hashtag Who is Zara Collins, was climbing alongside it, fed by people who had watched the video and wanted to know more about the woman who had walked out of that restaurant without flinching. The comment section was a portrait of public opinion in full motion. People who had immediately identified Nathan pulled his LinkedIn profile, found his business address, posted photos of his office building alongside screenshots of the video. 3 of his prospective partners had already posted publicly that they would not be moving forward with planned meetings. Lou Bernardine had sent a collection notice to his office, the $5,000 bill, still unpaid, now a matter of public record. Zara's phone had been ringing since before Rel called. She started returning calls. Harold Ashton's call came at 10:15, and it began with an apology she hadn't expected. "Miss Collins," he said. And the shift from the way Nathan had always introduced her, my wife Zara, to the formal recognition of her own name felt like something important happening. "I want to be upfront about something that has been bothering me since I looked into your background after that evening." He paused, and she waited. 3 years ago, I used a research paper on municipal housing fund allocation in a policy proposal that my firm submitted to the city council. It was cited extensively. It formed the backbone of our community partnership framework. The author was listed as Z. Collins. Another pause. "I had no idea that was you." Nathan never mentioned it. Not once. The silence that followed carried more weight than anything Harold Ashton might have said to fill it. Nathan had known. She had published that paper 2 years into their marriage, had been genuinely proud of it, had mentioned it to him more than once. He had called it hobby writing. He had mentioned it at parties occasionally in passing as an amusing detail about his wife's little side interests, never as an achievement, never as a credential, never as the serious professional work it was. And all along the paper had been sitting in the reference libraries of the very firms he was trying to court, cited by the very people he wanted to impress, authored by the woman he was calling a disgrace at dinner. "I'd like to offer you a consulting contract for our East Portland mixed-use development," Harold said. "We need someone who understands community partnership from the inside. I've done enough research in the last 2 weeks to know that person is you. And I want to be clear that this has nothing to do with what happened at the restaurant. This is about your work." By noon, Patricia Ashton had sent a personal email, warm direct 3 paragraphs describing 35 years of marriage and saying she had never seen anyone absorb cruelty with the particular grace Zara had shown. Attached was a list of 6 organizations Patricia was involved with that were actively searching for consultants. "Your reputation precedes you," the email said. It always did. Some of us just weren't paying close enough attention. Candace Rivera sent 2 messages, both asking to talk, both explaining that she hadn't known the full truth of the situation. Zara read them with something approaching sympathy, a 25-year-old who had believed a charming man's account of his own life, which was a mistake that was not exactly original, and replied with 2 sentences, "I'm building my own life. What happens between you and Nathan is no longer something I carry." Then she blocked the number and returned to work. By 3 in the afternoon, she had booked 3 client meetings for the following week, received an invitation to speak at a regional women in business conference, and received a call from a television producer asking if she'd be willing to discuss her experience on camera. She declined the television interview. She wasn't a story to be consumed. She was a professional with a practice to build. She turned her phone face up on her desk and let it ring. He arrived 3 weeks after the video unannounced, and Zara looked up from her desk to find a man whose presence filled the doorway of her small, light-filled office suite. The way powerful men always fill doorways not with physical size alone, but with the accumulated weight of decades of being listened to. Roberto Rivera was tall, impeccably dressed, silver-haired at the temples, and wearing an expression she had not expected to see on his face. He was sorry. "Please sit down," she said, because her mother had taught her that grace costs nothing, and sometimes it costs everything not to have it. He sat. He placed a folder on the desk between them without speaking, and she opened it and understood immediately what she was looking at. A complete financial trail meticulously organized, documenting every dollar Nathan had transferred from her accounts into Candace Rivera's life. 12 months of rent on an apartment Zara had never heard of, jewelry receipts, restaurant bills, weekend trips to 3 different cities, a bracelet that cost more than Zara's first car. "Candace brought this to me," Roberto said. She discovered the truth about how those funds were sourced after the video became public and Nathan's business began falling apart. "She came home and put everything on my kitchen table and could not stop apologizing." He paused. "She ended the relationship immediately. I want you to know that." "You didn't have to bring this to me," Zara said. "I did," he said simply. "I entertained Nathan Patterson as a serious suitor for my daughter. I asked about his financial stability. I accepted his account of his marriage as temporary, a situation in transition, without doing the basic due diligence I apply to every business relationship I enter. That was a failure on my part, and it contributed to what was done to you." He looked at her steadily. "I also wanted you to know that I have had several conversations with colleagues in this city's investment community over the past 2 weeks." "What kind of conversations?" "The kind that a man who controls significant capital has when he wants to ensure that people he trusts know who they are actually doing business with." The slight hardness in his voice when he said the last part left no ambiguity about who he meant. After he left, Rel called with the next piece of the picture. Nathan's business partner had filed a motion to dissolve their joint entity, citing reputational damage and the loss of 3 major clients in a single month. The downtown office lease co-signed by that partner had reverted to Nathan's sole responsibility, a lease he could not afford. Zara pulled up Nathan's business website on her computer. It looked the same as it always had: professional photos, polished bio testimonials from satisfied clients, except for a small disclaimer added to the footer: Jerome Patterson is currently operating as a sole proprietor. Previous case studies may reflect work completed in partnership with other professionals. He'd already been edged out. The empire he had built on the premise of his own exceptionalism was collapsing from its own foundation, and she hadn't had to touch a single brick. She closed the laptop and looked out the window at the city below, the afternoon light moving across the buildings in long gold stripes, and she breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth and felt something that she had been waiting years to feel again, the specific, irreplaceable sensation of taking up exactly the amount of space you are entitled to. She had work to do. He came on a Friday evening 6 weeks after Lou Bernardine, when the building had already emptied out and Zara was alone at her desk with a contract review and a glass of water that had gone warm, and when she looked up and saw him standing in her office doorway, her first thought was not anger and not fear, but something closer to recognition. The recognition of a moment she had known was coming and had been, without realizing it, preparing for. Nathan Patterson looked like a different version of himself, constructed from the same materials but assembled under different conditions. His platinum blonde hair was still there but had lost its precision, the careful styling gone soft and slightly disheveled in a way that would have been imperceptible to most people, but was immediately visible to a woman who had watched him spend 40 minutes in front of a mirror before every significant meeting for 8 years. The suit was the same suit he'd worn to the last quarterly review dinner. She recognized the faint blue stripe in the charcoal, but it had been living in a closet without proper care, and it showed. The circles under his eyes were deep and genuine, not the cosmetic fatigue of a man who works too hard, but the hollowed look of someone who has been unable to sleep because the thoughts come too fast at night. "Hello, Zara." She didn't invite him in. She didn't reach for her phone. She looked at him and waited. "I want to come home," he said. The words sat in the air between them, and she studied them the way she had learned to study everything in the weeks since Lou Bernardine, not for what they sounded like, but for what they actually meant. "You want to come home?" she repeated slowly, as though trying the words in her mouth to test their flavor. "I made a terrible mistake," he said, stepping into the office without being invited, which the old Nathan would never have done, and which told her more about his current state than anything else he might say. "The biggest mistake of my life. I threw away the best thing I had, and I know that now, and I need you to know that I know it." She let him keep going. She had learned somewhere in the long nights since his departure that certain men need to exhaust themselves before they can hear anything that doesn't come from inside their own heads, and she was no longer interested in cutting Nathan short. She was interested in hearing the whole thing because she wanted to know, needed to know for reasons that had more to do with her own understanding than with anything he could offer her, whether there was anything real underneath all of it. He talked for 11 minutes. She clocked it on the clock on her wall. He said the words counseling and start over, and I didn't mean it, and we can fix this, and once, incredibly, the word borrowed again in relation to the money which she let pass without interrupting. When he was finished, she stood up and walked to the window. "You know what I've realized, Nathan?" she said, looking out at the city rather than at him. "I don't think you were angry that night at Lou Bernardine. I think it was the first honest thing you'd said to me in years." She turned around. "You told me I was holding you back. You told me success required leaving dead weight behind. And you meant every word of it, not in the heat of the moment, but as a considered position that you had arrived at over months of planning." She watched his face. "The first withdrawal from my personal account happened on October 14th. The emails to Roberto Rivera about Candace were sent in August. You booked a weekend trip to Seattle with her in September, 2 weeks before Lou Bernardine." She paused. "That dinner wasn't a loss of control. It was the last scene of a play you'd been writing for a year." Nathan's mouth opened, and then it closed. He said after a long moment, "I felt trapped." "Tell me," she said. He was still talking something about ambition, about wanting to build something that mattered, about feeling suffocated by what he called her contentment with smallness, when Zara became aware that they were not alone. The door was open, as it always was when she was working late in an otherwise empty building, and in the gap of the door frame stood a girl of about 12 with neat braids and a Navy school uniform and a backpack hanging off one shoulder. watching the two adults in the office with the particular attention of a child who has walked into the middle of something she doesn't fully understand, but knows is important. Her mother appeared behind her a moment later, a woman in a building cleaning uniform who had clearly come to collect her daughter from the lobby where the girl had been waiting and had followed the sound of voices to the wrong floor at the wrong moment. The mother put a hand on the girl's shoulder, ready to steer her away, but the girl had already seen what she needed to see. In a whisper that was just barely, not a whisper the kind that children produce when they forget to account for acoustics, she said to her mother, "Mama, why does that man keep asking for something that he's the one who threw away?" The question dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Nathan stopped mid-sentence. The silence that followed was the most complete silence Zara had experienced since the night she stood in Nathan's empty closet and understood what had been done to her. And in that silence, she looked at the girl in the doorway, 12 years old, backpack on her shoulder. No investment in the outcome of this conversation, no reason to be diplomatic about what she could plainly see and felt. Something moved through her chest that she would later struggle to name, but that was closest to gratitude. The girl's name Zara would later learn was Sophia. Nathan had no answer for the question. He opened his mouth, looked at Sophia, looked back at Zara, and found that the architecture of his argument, built so carefully on the language of mistakes and reconciliation and starting over, had simply collapsed in the face of 12 words from a child who hadn't been asked. Zara crossed the office and opened the door fully. She smiled at Sophia's mother, the warm, direct smile of one woman acknowledging another, and gestured them both inside. "Come in, please, and sit in the reception area. I'll just be a moment." Then she turned to the desk and pressed the security desk line. "This is Zara Collins on the 4th floor. I have a visitor who was just leaving." Nathan looked at her one last time, the expression on his face cycling rapidly through something that might have been appeal or anger or the first real acknowledgement that this was genuinely finally over. And then the security guard appeared in the doorway and Nathan Patterson walked out of Zara Collins's office without another word. Sophia, from her seat in the reception area, watched him go with the frank, uncomplicated assessment of someone who had already made up her mind. After the security guard had gone and Nathan's footsteps had faded down the hallway toward the elevator, the office returned to its quiet, the ambient hum of the building, the faint sound of the city below, the warm circle of light from Zara's desk lamp, and Sophia sat in one of the reception chairs with her backpack in her lap, while her mother spoke softly to the building manager on the phone in the corridor. Zara came and sat in the chair across from her, not at the desk, not in a position of authority, but at the same level, because the girl had just done something quietly extraordinary and deserved to be met where she was. "How long were you standing there?" Zara asked. "Long enough," Sophia said with the direct simplicity of someone who has learned that the truth is almost always the more interesting answer. Zara almost laughed. "Your question, the one you asked your mother? He heard it, you know." Sophia considered this without embarrassment. "Good," she said. They sat together for a moment, the woman and the girl, and Zara thought about what she had said to Nathan before Sophia's question had changed everything. The words she had chosen, the tone she had found, the feeling of finally saying the things she had been not saying for years. She thought about the way his face had looked when she had laid out the timeline of his planning. Not shocked exactly, but caught the particular expression of a person who has been operating under the assumption that they were the only one paying attention. She had told him the truth not to wound him, but because the truth was what she had the clearest, most permanent thing available to her, and she was done trading it away for the sake of managing someone else's comfort. What she had said to him before the security guard arrived had not been an ultimatum or a speech or a final dramatic gesture. It had been quieter than that and more lasting. She had told him that she was not going to continue allowing the worst thing that had happened to her to be the most important thing about her. that she was building a business with her own skills and her own name and her own money, and no part of that future would require his participation or his permission. That the version of herself she had been for the last 8 years, smaller, quieter, carefully arranged around his ego, had not been the real version, and she was finished grieving it. And she had said one last thing, looking at him steadily. "You taught me how strong I was by treating me like I was nothing. I don't forgive you for it, but I'm grateful for what I learned." Now, in the quiet of the empty office, Sophia looked at her with the directness that children have before the world teaches them to soften their attention. "Are you sad?" the girl asked. Zara thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. "Yes," she said, "but not because he left. I'm sad because I waited so long before I remembered who I actually was." She paused. "Does that make sense?" Sophia nodded slowly, the kind of nod that means yes, and I'm filing this away for later. "What do you do now?" Sophia asked. Zara looked around her office, the business cards on the desk, the zoning documents, the Harold Ashton contract folder, the framed photo of herself at a community development conference that she had taken down from her old study after Nathan moved out and hung here instead in this new space as the first deliberate act of reclaiming something. The windows were dark now, the city glittering below in long rows of lights, and there was so much work left to do, so much space ahead that was entirely hers to fill. She smiled, the real one, the one that came from somewhere deep rather than somewhere practiced. "Now I work," she said. Sophia's mother appeared in the doorway, apologetic, and Sophia stood up and swung her backpack onto her shoulder with the easy physicality of children who have not yet learned to carry their bodies with self-consciousness. She paused at the door. "My maman says that the worst thing that can happen to someone is to forget they're worth something," she said. "She says it happens to smart people all the time." Zara looked at the mother in the doorway, a woman in a cleaning uniform at the end of a long shift with tired eyes and a straight spine, and a 12-year-old daughter who spoke like she did and understood that Sophia had not invented that wisdom on her own. "Your mother is right," Zara said. "Tell her I said so." After they left, Zara sat at her desk for a long time without opening any of the folders or answering any of the emails or returning any of the calls that had accumulated through the evening. She just sat in the quiet and the lamplight and let herself be exactly where she was, not looking backward, not yet fully forward, just present in the middle of a life that was for the first time in years entirely and unconditionally her own. Then she opened the Portland zoning document, uncapped her pen, and got back to work. If this story is resonating with you, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment. We read every single one. 6 months after the night at Lou Bernardine, the office of Collins Community Development occupied a bright corner suite on the 4th floor of a building Zara had signed a lease on herself with her own credit under her own name without asking anyone's permission or adjusting the decision to fit someone else's idea of appropriate ambition. 8 people worked there now. Urban planners, grant writers, a community liaison coordinator who had reached out after reading about Zara's work in a nonprofit newsletter. And the walls held exactly 3 framed items: her Northwestern MBA, the cover page of the Journal of Urban Development issue that had published her housing allocation research, and a photo of her team at the groundbreaking ceremony for the East Portland mixed-use project, everyone's faces turned toward the camera with the specific happiness of people doing work they believe in. The Ashton project had been the first and, in many ways, the most important, not because of the contract value, but because it had been the proof of concept, the demonstration that what she had to offer was real and substantial and entirely independent of anything Nathan Patterson had ever done or said or been. Harold Ashton had told her at the project conclusion meeting that her community partnership framework had solved a problem his firm had been circling for 2 years and that he had already passed her name to 3 colleagues in Portland's development community. Those 3 referrals had produced 4 contracts. Those 4 contracts had produced 6 more. The book Reclaiming Your Worth, A Guide to Financial and Emotional Recovery After Abuse, was with her editor 3 weeks from publication, and the advance had been enough to hire her third full-time employee. Letters had been arriving for weeks, forwarded through her publisher from women who had read articles about her and wanted her to know that they existed, that they were sitting in houses that had been quietly dismantled around them, and needed to know that the woman who had walked out of Lou Bernardine with her head high and built something from the rubble was real. She read every letter. Nathan, according to Rayleigh's periodic updates, was 3 months into a bankruptcy proceeding that had consumed his downtown office lease, his investment accounts, and what remained of his professional reputation. The IRS audit of his business expenses, triggered by questions that arose from the divorce discovery process, was ongoing. He was living in a studio apartment on the east side of the city and working on commission selling commercial insurance. Candace Rivera had moved back to Seattle. Roberto Rivera had declined all contact. Zara received this information and noticed each time that she felt nothing. No satisfaction, no sorrow, no residual pull of the 8 years she had invested in a version of this man that had never been fully real. The absence of feeling was not numbness. It was something cleaner than that, the emotional equivalent of a room after it has been emptied and scrubbed and is now simply waiting to be used for something new. She had stopped following his story. She was too busy writing her own. Patricia Ashton had made the introduction in a characteristically direct email. There is a doctor doing important work with underserved communities who has been trying to navigate federal grant requirements with no success for 18 months. His name is James Okafor. He needs exactly the expertise you have. I've taken the liberty of giving him your number. The call from Dr. Okafor came 2 days later, unhurried, focused, with the particular quality of someone who is genuinely interested in solving a problem and genuinely unconcerned with performing the interest. He ran a free community health clinic in a part of the city that had been systematically underserved by the healthcare infrastructure for decades, and he wanted to expand their mental health services to meet a demand that was overwhelming their current capacity, and the federal funding structures that could make that possible were, in his words, a labyrinth designed by people who have never actually needed to find their way through one. They met at a coffee shop downtown on a Wednesday afternoon, and Zara arrived a few minutes early and watched him walk in, a tall man in his early 40s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a paper folder under his arm, who spotted her immediately, smiled, and waited for her to stand before extending his hand. A small thing, an almost imperceptible thing, but Zara had been paying a different kind of attention to small things since Lou Bernardine, and she noticed. They talked for 90 minutes about grant structures, about community health needs, about the specific bureaucratic obstacles standing between his clinic and the funding it required. It was the kind of conversation Zara had spent years missing, without fully naming what she was missing, professional substantive between two people who respected each other's knowledge, where no one was performing and no one was managing an audience of imaginary observers. When Nathan appeared in the doorway of the coffee shop 40 minutes into the meeting, she saw him before he saw her, and her first feeling, which she noted and set aside, was not fear or dread, but a flat, tired irritation at the interruption. He looked worse than he had at her office. The platinum blonde hair had gone several shades lighter from lack of attention, and the jacket he wore was the kind of thing a man buys when the wardrobes of his former life have been sold or stored. He scanned the room, found her, and came directly to the table with the focused gait of a man who has decided something on his way through the door. "Zara," he said, "I need to talk to you. I'm in a meeting, Nathan. This is important. About the bankruptcy proceedings. That's between your attorney and mine." She kept her voice level and her attention deliberately on James, who was watching the exchange with a calm that she found in that moment genuinely steadying. Nathan looked at James with the assessing expression of a man who has spent years categorizing other men by their apparent status. "Who is this?" "That isn't your business." He pulled out the empty chair at their table. James stood up not aggressively, not performatively, but with the easy certainty of someone who has decided that a situation requires action and is simply acting. "I think you should leave," James said. Quiet, direct, final. Nathan didn't leave. He looked at Zara and began a version of the same conversation she had heard 3 times, now the language of victimhood that had replaced the language of contempt, the claim that she was the agent of his destruction, rather than the consequence of his own choices. The coffee shop had gone quiet in the specific way that spaces go quiet when something is happening that everyone has decided not to officially notice while noticing completely. Zara stood up. She spoke clearly and without drama because she was done with drama, because drama had always required an audience whose opinion she cared about, and she no longer cared about any audience that included Nathan Patterson. She said the things that were true, that she had documented a theft, filed a legal case, and built a business, and that none of those actions were revenge. They were simply facts. And when she was finished, the manager of the coffee shop appeared at Nathan's elbow, and the matter resolved itself. Nathan left. The coffee shop returned to its normal register of conversation. James sat back down. "I'm sorry you had to see that," Zara said. "You handled it with more patience than it deserved," he said, and picked up his notes exactly where they had left off. The formal offer came 3 weeks later in a document from the clinic's board of directors, 4 pages professionally prepared outlining the position of Director of Community Partnerships, a full-time role overseeing grant applications, community organization relationships, and the clinic's expansion strategy, with an equity stake in the organization and a seat on the board. Zara read it 3 times at her desk with the door closed. James had called ahead to explain the context, that the offer had been the board's idea, that he had recused himself from the discussion and the vote because of the obvious conflict of interest that the decision had been made on professional merits by people who had reviewed her track record independently and concluded that she was the right person for the work. He said this clearly and without apology, the way honest people state honest things, and she appreciated the clarity of it. She also appreciated what he said next. "I want to be straightforward with you about something. I would very much like to continue knowing you on a personal level. But this offer is entirely separate from that. If you take the position and nothing else ever develops between us, that would be a completely acceptable outcome. If you decline the position, I'll still want to buy you coffee sometimes and talk about grant structures. I just think you should have all the information." She almost laughed. "Most people don't lead with all the information. Most people waste a lot of time as a result," he said. She asked for 2 weeks to decide, which he granted without pressure, which itself told her something important. She spent those 2 weeks doing what she had learned in the course of rebuilding her life was the only reliable method for making a decision. She paid attention to what she actually felt rather than what she was supposed to feel. She had spent 8 years making decisions based on what would accommodate Nathan, what would make him proud, what would keep the peace, what would fit the version of her that he had decided was appropriate. And she was still in small ways. She was actively working to unlearn, inclined to check her own instincts against an imaginary approval she no longer needed from anyone. What she actually felt paying careful attention was this: she wanted the work. She had always wanted this kind of work. The intersection of healthcare access and community development. The complicated, beautiful problem of helping people navigate a system that was not designed with them in mind. She had wanted it before she met Nathan, and had set it aside gradually and without noticing as his priorities had colonized hers. She also, in the spirit of having all the information, felt something warm and careful and still largely undiscovered when James Okafor called to check in on the decision timeline, and she noticed that she had already been looking at her phone to see if he'd called. She called Raleigh on a Thursday evening from her balcony. "He offered me a job," she said. The doctor. And I want to take it. I think I want to take it for every right reason and no wrong ones, and I have no idea how to be certain of that." Raleigh was quiet for a moment. You know what the difference is between this and 8 years ago. 8 years ago, you wanted Nathan to want you. Now you're asking whether you want something. That's the whole difference. That's everything. Zara stood on her balcony in the November air, the city laid out below her in all its ordinary magnificence, lit windows and wet streets, and the faint sound of traffic 11 stories down, and she felt the particular quality of a life that had been cleared out and was now carefully and deliberately being filled again with things she had actually chosen. The next morning she called James and accepted the position. He said excellent in the way people say a word when they mean considerably more than the word. She smiled at her phone and went back to work. The auditorium held 500 people and every seat was full. Zara stood in the wings of the Pacific Northwest Women in Business Conference stage and listened to the applause following the introduction and did not feel nervous, which surprised her because she had been nervous the first time she gave a speech at a professional conference. She had been 29, presenting her housing allocation research to a room of 40 urban planners, and her hands had shaken visibly on the podium. She remembered Nathan telling her afterward that it was fine that nobody had noticed in the particular tone of someone who had noticed and was choosing to be generous about it. She did not feel nervous now because she was not performing. She was just going to talk about what had happened and what she had learned from it, and she had been doing that for long enough that the words came from somewhere below performance, somewhere solid. She walked out onto the stage, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at 500 faces, women of various ages and backgrounds and industries, some of whom had come specifically because of the book, some of whom would not have known her name 8 months ago. And she opened with the words Nathan had said to her at Lou Bernardine spoken clearly into the microphone. The way you can repeat a thing that once had power over you, once it no longer does. You're an embarrassment. The room went very still. 18 months ago, she said, a man said those words to me in a restaurant full of people, left me with a $5,000 bill, and walked out of my life convinced that he had left me with nothing. She paused. He was wrong. He left me with myself. It just took me a little while to figure out what that was worth. In the front row, Raleigh was making the face she made when she was proud of someone and trying to maintain professional composure and failing at both simultaneously. Beside her sat Patricia Ashton, who had attended every public event Zara had spoken at since the conference invitation arrived not out of guilt, but out of genuine regard. Beside Patricia sat Sophia's mother, whose name was Claudette, who had become in the strange non-linear way that life occasionally produces someone Zara had lunch with once a month, and who had started taking evening courses in community health administration. And beside Claudette sat Sophia, now 13, with a small notebook open on her knee and a pen moving across it as Zara spoke. After the speech during the reception, Sophia navigated through the crowd with the focused purposefulness of someone who knows where they're going and is not going to be deterred by adults standing in the way. She found Zara by the water table, held up the notebook, and Zara looked at what she had written. A single line in careful handwriting. Don't wait for someone to humiliate you before you remember who you are. Zara read it twice. Then she looked at Sophia, who was watching her with the patient expression of someone who has delivered a message and is waiting to see if it arrived properly. "Can I keep this?" Zara asked. Sophia turned to Claudette, who nodded. "You can," Sophia said. "But put Mama's name in the acknowledgments of your next book. She says the same thing to me every morning before school." Zara looked at Claudette, a woman who had been cleaning other people's office buildings at 2 a.m. for a decade, raising a daughter who wrote lines like that in her notebook and gave them away freely to strangers who needed them, and felt something move through her chest that had no precise name, but was in the family of gratitude and in the family of love. "Your mother's name will be in the acknowledgments," she said, "and yours." Sophia considered this, then nodded, satisfied, settled, already moving on to the next thing with the clean confidence of someone who has learned from the woman beside her that she doesn't need to make herself smaller to make room for other people's surprise at how much space she deserves to take up. In the Phoenix airport in the departure terminal for a connecting flight to a job interview in Denver, Nathan Patterson sat in a plastic chair with his phone in his hand and watched his ex-wife command 500 people on a live stream he had not meant to click on. He had seen the conference announcement on a professional networking feed listed under keynote speakers, and her name had been there, Zara Collins. Not Zara Patterson, Zara Collins. And he had told himself he was just going to watch a minute to see how she looked. He watched the whole thing. The woman on the stage was not the woman he had introduced at business dinners as my wife Zara, with the slight emphasis that indicated she was a supporting character in the story he was telling about himself. She was not the woman who had handed him his coffee in the morning and adjusted her schedule around his and attended his functions in the right dresses and smiled at the right moments and quietly, persistently over years made herself smaller and smaller until she occupied almost no space at all except as a reference point for his own size. The woman on the stage was somebody. She had always been somebody. He understood that now, with the particular clarity that arrives too late to be useful, the clarity of consequence of looking back from a position of loss and seeing the value of what you destroyed with the precision that was unavailable to you while you were destroying it. He turned off the phone when the speech ended. He looked out the airport window at the tarmac, at the planes moving in their slow, purposeful patterns, and he sat with the truth of the thing for a long time without trying to reframe it or redistribute the responsibility or locate the narrative that made him the more sympathetic figure. He was working on that, not working quickly, not working easily, but working, learning to hold the reality of what he had done without immediately reaching for a version of it that was easier to carry. He had a job interview in Denver with a mid-size financial consultancy that his cousin had arranged, and the salary was a fraction of what he had been billing 2 years ago, and the apartment he would be renting if he got the position was a studio in a neighborhood he would once have driven through without considering as a place where people lived. None of that was Zara's doing. He knew that. He was working on knowing it all the way down in the places where the knowing actually changes something. The boarding announcement came, and he stood and gathered his carry-on, a single bag which was everything he had brought with him, and walked toward the gate. At the newsstand beside the gate in the small rack of featured books near the register, a cover caught his eye. Clean design, a woman's silhouette. A title in bold type, Reclaiming Your Worth, by Zara Collins. He stood there for a moment, the boarding announcement repeating behind him, people moving around him in both directions. He didn't pick it up. He didn't need to read it to know what was inside. He had been living the other half of that story for a year and a half, and he understood with the particular exhausted clarity of someone who has watched the consequences of his choices fully arrive that everything she had written and said and built was the direct and proportional result of everything he had done. He walked past the newsstand and boarded his flight. He did not look back. Zara did not know about this moment. She would never know about it. It was entirely irrelevant to her life, which was, and this was the truest thing about the whole story, no longer about Nathan Patterson in any way at all. The email from Lou Bernardine arrived on a Tuesday morning, sent by the restaurant's general manager, and it was polite and slightly formal and unexpected in the best way. The restaurant, the manager wrote, had been receiving reservation requests for Table 12, specifically groups of women, mostly who had read about what happened there and wanted to sit at that particular table for reasons that were personal and varied, and almost always when they explained them a version of the same reason because the table had become, in the particular way that specific places sometimes do, a symbol of something. The manager wanted to know if Zara would be willing to be acknowledged in some way. A small plaque, a mention on the menu, whatever felt appropriate in honor of the fact that the restaurant's occupancy rate had increased significantly in the 18 months since the video, and that a meaningful portion of that increase could be traced directly to her. Zara read the email twice, smiled at the specificity of the irony. Nathan's attempt to humiliate her publicly had become, among other things, a significant revenue driver for the establishment where he had attempted to do it, and wrote back with a single request. She asked that Table 12 generate a monthly contribution to a scholarship fund she was establishing for women pursuing graduate degrees in urban planning and community development in an amount to be agreed upon between the restaurant and the fund's administrators. No plaque, no name on the menu, just a table doing work. The manager agreed by return email within the hour. The $5,000 bill from that September evening still sat in Nathan's bankruptcy files, one line item among many, a debt that had outlasted the marriage and the relationship and the investment firm and the downtown office and most of what Nathan had built his identity around. It would probably never be paid, not in any financial sense, not in any form that would register as a transaction in a ledger somewhere. But Zara stood at the window of the community health clinic on a Thursday afternoon in late spring, watching through the glass as the construction crew put the finishing touches on the new wing, a mental health services expansion that would serve 3,000 additional patients a year, funded by a combination of federal grants she had written, private donations she had cultivated, and the equity she had built over 18 months of work that was entirely irreversibly hers. And she understood that the bill had been paid in every way that actually mattered. James appeared beside her, white coat, reading glasses, a patient file in his hand that he had clearly just put down to come stand next to her for a moment, which was something he did sometimes, and which she had stopped pretending she didn't look forward to. They stood together at the window without speaking for a little while, watching the construction and the city beyond it, and the late afternoon light moving across everything. And it was enough, simply the two of them standing in a place they had built together, doing work they believed in at the end of a day that had been full of difficult and important things. "The final inspection is next week," he said eventually. "I know," she said. "I have the paperwork." He smiled without looking at her, and she smiled at the window, and the city went on below them in all its complicated, ordinary, magnificent persistence. One night in September, a woman had walked out of the most expensive restaurant in the city, carrying nothing but her dignity and the slowly forming knowledge of who she actually was beneath 8 years of careful diminishment. She had left the bill on the table where it belonged with the man who had ordered the wine and chosen the menu, and arranged the evening as the final performance of a role she had not agreed to play. She had lost nothing that night that she needed. She had collected in the months that followed everything she had set down: her name, her work, her voice, her worth, the full and uncompromising knowledge that the most important thing a person can refuse to give away is the truth of who they are. The restaurant bill from Lou Bernardine was never paid in dollars. It was paid instead in the only currency that lasts. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear from you. Subscribe to our channel and drop a comment below, telling us where you're watching from. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and we'll see you in the next story.